There's a concept in philosophy known as fatalism. It's a generally pessimistic view of the universe and how we live in the universe during our short time here. There's different contexts that people use the term fatalism in, and there's nuance to it, but in general, it's this idea that in some way, the universe and the future is already laid out in stone. And if we can't change that, then what's the point of living? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines fatalism more or less as, quote, though the word fatalism is commonly used to refer to an attitude of resignation in the face of some future event or events which are thought to be inevitable, philosophers usually use the word to refer to the view that we are powerless to do anything other than what we actually do. End quote. I think the key phrase in that definition is the attitude of resignation. There's a lot of ways to apply the concept of fatalism. Typically, like the definition said, it gets used in this context of free will. Does free will exist? Is the universe determined? Is everything already set in stone by a long chain of cause and effect, and we're just sort of cogs in the machine who don't really have the freedom to choose? And I think that debate between free will and determinism is interesting, but I think when most people talk about fatalism in everyday contexts or when they behave in a fatalistic way, it's usually just this attitude of resignation to some future event that they see as inevitable. This fatalistic worldview often leads to a interpretation of the world as meaningless and as our actions in the world as meaningless. On a cosmic scale, all of us are really just specks of dust on a big blue marble flying around a giant ball of gas until eventually all of this goes away. And in the grand scheme of things, we're all just a tiny speck. Eventually, this all is going to end, whether it's the heat death of the universe or whatever else. So who cares about any of it, right? On a personal level, if you began to see the world in a fatalistic point of view, then because you can't change the outcome of that event, or you can't change the outcome of you getting fired from your job, or you can't change the outcome of the way that your relationship fell apart, then what's the point of getting up out of bed in the morning? Fatalism like this often gets associated with things like depression or learned helplessness or any other negative connotations. There is this meaninglessness that is associated with fatalism, which to many people would make going through life that way kind of a bummer. Now, aside from some of those negative aspects of fatalism that we've talked about, most philosophers have other good reasons for rejecting fatalism, whether it's logical arguments or breaking down the nuances of free will and determinism. There's plenty of good reasons to reject fatalism. That being said, I don't think I've ever come across a better antidote to fatalistic thinking than Ken Liu's incredibly powerful short story, Mono no Aware. Based on the Japanese philosophical concept of Mono no Aware, I think the story gives us important insights into the nature of beauty and sacrifice and connection and even the meaning of life. This story is a bit of a science fiction story, so it opens as many science fiction stories do with a apocalyptic context. At some point in the future, a massive asteroid that becomes known as the Hammer is headed towards Earth, ready to destroy it. Rather than banding together as a united front against the existential threat, the countries of the world somewhat predictably devolve into squabbling and war and chaos instead. The main character of the story, a boy at this point, his name is Hiroto, describes what was happening on Earth as the asteroid was coming to hit it. Quote, "I had seen on TV what was happening in other places around the world. Looters screaming, dancing through the streets, soldiers and policemen shooting into the air and sometimes into crowds, burning buildings, teetering piles of dead bodies, generals shouting before frenzied crowds, vowing vengeance for ancient grievances even as the world was ending." End quote. As the Hammer is crashing down towards Earth, the plan of humanity seems to be to create what the narrator calls habitat modules. In other science fiction stories, you might see these called generational ships. The idea is to pack as many people as you can into spaceships and send them off into space in search of a place where humanity can continue to exist, even if the Earth is destroyed. So these ships could be in space for hundreds, thousands of years, and they're able to survive and be self-sufficient and produce children and do all of the things that humanity does in the context of this generational ship. And hopefully it eventually arrives at the destination and humanity can reset, so to speak. The problem in the story is that most of the ships, in fact, all of the generational habitat modules fail. And there's only one secret ship left that has room for about 1,000 people to carry on the legacy of humanity. Hiroto's mom has a former love interest known as Dr. Hamilton, who offers Hiroto's mom a spot on this secret generational ship that's going to preserve humanity. She declines the offer, but she gets Dr. Hamilton to agree to take Hiroto in her place. There's the tearful goodbye scene, and the rest of the story plays out as sort of two separate stories. On the one hand, there's Hiroto's experience on the generational ship years later, and simultaneously, he's remembering stories and conversations that he had with his dad back in the past on Earth. On the ship, Hiroto worries that he is pretty much the last vestige of Japanese culture, so he spends time teaching children about Japan and about his heritage, and that's important to him. He also has a love interest known as Mindy, who he spends time with, and he enjoys looking out into the stars. But he explains how this is kind of a weird feeling for him. He says, quote, "There are no windows in the habitat module, no casual view of the stars streaming past. Most people don't care, having grown bored of seeing the stars long ago. But I like looking through the cameras mounted on the bottom of the ship so that I can gaze at this view of the receding reddish glow of our sun, our past." End quote. It's interesting how Hiroto describes the way that people get bored of looking at the stars. When you think about that for a second, it seems crazy that even the magnificent can become routine if you don't notice it, or at least if you don't appreciate the magnificence of it. These amazing giant balls of gas and light can become just another piece of the universe that fades into the background if you don't pay attention to it. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful and important parts of life are just sitting there unnoticed and faded into the routine. When Hiroto remembers these conversations and stories that he had with his dad, oftentimes they're about sacrifice and how one person fits into the big picture instead of being weighed down by their own selfish desires. Oftentimes these conversations are about rising above the selfish needs of yourself for the good of everybody. It's here in the story where we start to get to this concept of mano no aware, with Hiroto remembering some of the poetry that his dad used to recite for him. Hiroto doesn't understand the poetry as a kid, but he would come to appreciate it by the end of the story. Here's one example, quote, "The fading sunlight holds infinite beauty, though it is so close to the day's end," end quote. Another example, quote, "A dandelion, in late autumn's cooling breeze, spreads seeds far and wide," end quote. In both cases here, you have this ethereal feeling of something being beautiful and timeless and permanent, but at the same time being right on the edge of the end. And there seems to be this strange connection between things that are beautiful, but at the same time fleeting and nomadic and transient. Hiroto describes his feelings on this type of poetry recited by his dad as a kid, and he describes one of the conversations he had, saying, quote, "The image seemed to me at once so fleeting and so permanent, like the way I had experienced time as a young child. It made me a little sad and glad at the same time. Everything passes, Hiroto," Dad said. "That feeling in your heart, it's called mano no aware. It is a sense of the transience of all things in life. The sun, the dandelion, the cicada, the hammer, and all of us. We are all subject to the equations of James Clerk Maxwell, and we are all ephemeral patterns destined to eventually fade, whether in a second or an eon." End quote. The concept of mano no aware is beginning to make sense to Hiroto, the way that beauty can reveal itself in the ordinary, the way that beauty can reveal itself in things that seemingly are ending, and the way that things can have unexplained and hidden meanings and deep, important meanings. Even in the face of the hammer, the asteroid that's going to cause the apocalypse of the Earth, and everything Hiroto knows and values, there is still something to be found there. There is magnificence to be uncovered. Later on in the story, on the generational ship, it's discovered that there's a hole in the sail that propels the ship through outer space. Hiroto hatches a plan to fix the hole in the sail by going out there onto the sail and fixing it, patching the hole. The problem is that it's a 72-hour journey to get out there, and he's racing against time. So if he falls victim to exhaustion, or if he falls asleep, or if he gets injured, then humanity is going to be erased from history. As he's working his way out there, he's drifting in and out of consciousness, exhausted, and he remembers some of the conversations he was having with his dad, especially one where the dad explains this concept of mano no aware. The dad says, quote, "We live in a land of volcanoes and earthquakes, typhoons and tsunamis, Hiroto. We have always faced a precarious existence, suspended in a thin strip on the surface of this planet between the fire underneath and the icy vacuum above. Yet it is this awareness of the closeness of death, of the beauty inherent in each moment, that allows us to endure. Mano no aware, my son, is an empathy with the universe. It is the soul of our nation. It has allowed us to endure Hiroshima, to endure the occupation, to endure deprivation and the prospect of annihilation without despair." End quote. As Hiroto is making his way out to the hole in the sail, and as he fixes it, he starts making connections between the speck of dust that created the hole and the lessons of Mano no aware that his dad taught him. He says, quote, "There was a hole in the torn sail before me. At the speed we're traveling, even a tiny speck of dust that escaped the ion shields can cause havoc. The jagged edge of the hole flaps gently in space, propelled by solar wind and radiation pressure. While an individual photon is tiny, insignificant, without even mass, all of them together can propel a sail as big as the sky and push 1,000 people along. The universe is wondrous." End quote. Unfortunately for Hiroto, on the journey out there, he banged a fuel tank against something and it leaked, which meant that he doesn't have enough fuel to plug the hole. So he decides to basically sacrifice himself by using the fuel that was supposed to be for his return journey back to the habitat module. So he plugs the hole and releases himself to become one with the stars that he spent his whole life admiring. And as he's fading into the stars and as he's looking at the ship being propelled to save humanity, he thinks about the importance of living for others and the importance of sacrifice. Earlier in the story, he remembers his dad saying, quote, "Understand that we are not defined by our individual loneliness, but by the web of relationships in which we're enmeshed. A person must rise above his selfish needs so that all of us can live in harmony." End quote. As he's fading into oblivion, Hiroto realizes that this is how you transcend death, and this is how you escape the trappings of fatalism. Through sacrifice and webs of relationships and connections with other people and living and dying for others. As he looks at the generational ship sailing on because of him, he thinks to himself, quote, "Mindy called me a hero, but I was simply a man in the right place at the right time. Dr. Hamilton is also a hero because he designed the ship. Mindy is also a hero because she kept me awake. My mother is also a hero because she was willing to give me up so that I could survive. My father is also a hero because he showed me the right thing to do. We are defined by the places we hold in the web of others' lives." End quote. It's true that at the end of the day, we are just specks and photons in the grand scheme of things. But while we're here, it is those connections and those relationships and the way that we appreciate and do things for others that gives things meaning and makes things beautiful. It is this transience and appreciation for the fleeting moments in life that gives us appreciation for the now. The realization that we are all driving together, pushing towards something, trying to get to a shared space that is good. And even when we get to that destination, it will end. And something else will come after that, even if that something is nothing. Even if the destination is fleeting, the journey is where the beauty is. And there's certainly beauty in that struggle and beauty in the concept of mano no aware, coming together and accepting the transient nature of life, grasping the moment even as the moment fades away. As Hiroto is falling into the stars at the end of the story, he thinks about going on one last walk with his dad. Quote, "It is a beautiful day for a walk, isn't it?" Dad says. And we walk together down the street so that we can remember every passing blade of grass, every dewdrop, every fading ray of the dying sun. Infinitely beautiful. End quote.